This is another lecture in the series called the Cambridge Autism Research Lecture Series. It's actually the fourth in the series. We've had inspiring talks by inspiring autistic people. Judy Singer was the first in this series, who coined the term neurodiversity. Professor Jason Arday spoke in this series. He's an autistic professor in this university. Holden Thorpe was our most recent speaker, who is autistic and also the editor-in-chief of Science, the journal. And today, following in the footsteps of those inspiring autistic people, is another autistic person who is inspiring, Daniel Tammet. So Daniel is a writer living in Paris. He also has a diagnosis of autism. And he's also been described as a savant with exceptional abilities in a number of different areas. First of all, memory. Daniel, you're going to have to correct me if I get this wrong, but he was the European champion for memorizing the number pi, and he memorized it to 22,514 decimal places. So most of us could probably memorize it to about 7 decimal places. And he recited it under invigilation in Oxford. That was the first time he kind of became, sort of drew attention to his exceptional abilities. Memory is one area, languages is another. He was actually a subject of a documentary, and I'll come back to languages in a second, which was called The Boy with the Incredible Brain, which also went under the title of Brain Man, I think. And in that, they didn't just explore his exceptional memory, but also his talent for language learning. And they wanted to kind of test whether he could learn any human language in less than a week, at least to a conversational level. So in the documentary, some of you may have watched it, it's available on YouTube. They didn't tell him where they were taking him, and they chose Iceland because Icelandic isn't that easy. So they kind of dropped him into Iceland, and at the end of a week, he was interviewed on Icelandic television and actually did a reasonable job. Not that I'm a judge. He also has exceptional abilities in calculation. So in the documentary, you see him multiplying, 3-digit numbers by another 3 digits faster than a handheld calculator or a computer. So very fast at kind of arithmetic calculation. Aside from being autistic, he's also a synesthete, meaning he gets a mixing of the senses. And for him, numbers have colors, numbers have shapes. When he's doing the calculation very rapidly, for him it's colors combining, shapes combining. He'll, I'm sure, talk about this. And in some of our research here in Cambridge, we found that synesthesia is more common in autistic people than in the general population. So I met Daniel now 20 years ago in the context of that documentary, but also he was exploring whether he might need a diagnosis of autism. So I diagnosed him on camera in Douglas House here in Cambridge. That was in 2004 when he was 25 years old. Since then, he's published 10 books, so quite astonishing for anybody. He's given TED Talks. I recommend you visit his TED Talk. I think the first book was called Born on a Blue Day, and that refers to his synesthesia. And it became the BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week. He's also written books with titles like Embracing a Wide Sky, Thinking in Numbers, and his most recent book, which is coming out on Thursday this week, is called 9 Lives. It's available for sale outside on the table, and it explores the diversity among the autistic spectrum, going into the minds of autistic people. So he's here kind of promoting his book. And actually 2 days ago, he was also talking at CRAE, the Centre for Research in Autism Education, which is part of UCL. So he's on a little bit of a book tour. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, Daniel. We've kind of kept track of each other over the years. Really inspiring, as I say. So we're very much looking forward to your talk.
I'm very happy to be back in Cambridge. It's been a long time since I was here. I was here originally 20 years ago, as Simon just mentioned. I've been back since for other brain scans and tests of how my brain works. But this is a long time coming, my return to Cambridge. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to all of you for coming to listen to me today. It's always so strange for me to imagine that people would actually take the time and trouble to come and listen to me share my story and talk about what's happening in my mind, but this has been the case for 20 years, so apparently there's something interesting for people who are not necessarily on the spectrum, but would like to understand how perhaps their own minds work or how other minds work. And because there's someone, apparently one of the people online is from Iceland, I should say takk fyrir hlusta. So it means thank you for listening. I'm going to talk about myself, first of all, my story, my journey. I want to talk about the book, of course, 9 Minds, why I'm here today. And then there will be some time for questions, so please feel free to ask. So I grew up in the east of London. Many years ago, my childhood was in the 1980s, just to situate it for people. And in those days, people didn't understand what autism was. There was no or very little public understanding of autism. I don't even know if it was a word that had any sort of public currency back then. Rain Man, the film Rain Man, was still a decade in the future. So my parents, when they had me, I was their first child. I would be the first of 9 children. So I had many brothers and sisters, which would prove to be incredibly helpful to me because we know now how important early life stimulation is for people on the spectrum. So I had an enormous amount of stimulation, as you can imagine. If you can imagine a home in which you have all these brothers and sisters playing, shouting, joking, laughing, running around. So that was my environment. So I had an enormous amount of stimulation. But as a baby, this is going on what my parents have told me, of course. I have a very good memory, but I don't remember this. Apparently I cried all the time. I was terrible. I was a terrible baby. I don't know why my parents went on to have eight more, but my mum was determined to have lots of children. And I cried so much, and my parents didn't have a lot of education. They hadn't gone to Cambridge or any university, as it happened. My father was a sheet metal worker, and subsequently became, with my mum, a full-time parent, of course. That was a job in itself, to raise all of us. But they had enormous love, and that was the most important quality in any parent. And they had incredible, I think now looking back, instincts, intuition. So they entrusted me to those intuitions, and they were very right to do so. So for example, I was crying all the time. They didn't realize I was overstimulated by certain sounds, certain lights, certain situations. And they instinctively, they would take a blanket, they would make a hammock out of the blanket, they would put me inside the hammock, and my dad on one side, my mum on the other side, they would rock me back and forth. And the regular, repetitive motion soothed me. And I just stopped crying. It was quite miraculous. And the other technique that they found worked was to put me into a buggy and just to walk me around the streets of East London. But the difficulty was, of course, that when they stopped, I would start crying again. So they would have to keep it. So it was excellent exercise for them, but it must have been quite tiring as well. And I had epilepsy as well, I remember, as a small child. I do remember my seizures. I remember particularly going to the hospital with my dad. My dad was very vigilant about my seizures. His father had epilepsy. My father was also schizophrenic. and there's also my nephews. Some of my nephews have autism, so there's clearly a lot of genetics, even though that doesn't explain everything. There's a lot of genetics in my family that must have played some significant role, I imagine, in the construction of my mind. And so my dad would take me to hospital something like 3 hours ahead of the appointment because he was so worried that we would somehow miss the doctor. I don't know. My mum would tease him about this, why are you taking him so many hours? And so I remember having the hours and hours in the hospital waiting for the appointment with the doctor, having the blood test because of the little tablets I had to take to control my seizures, and having to have regular blood tests. And then they would put a little sticker on my arm where I'd had the blood taken with a smiley face on it. And so these are some of my earliest childhood memories. And I had the seizures, and when I started going to school, I went to standard schools because back then we didn't know, obviously, we didn't know in the 80s what autism was. We didn't know what special education would look like. There was no concept of giftedness either. Whether or not I would have been considered gifted at that age, I don't know. Because I was already doing things in my head, even back then at my earliest age, but it was very difficult for me to talk about it. I didn't have a lot of words. I didn't have any language delay that I know of, but words didn't come easily to me. And so I started school, and often I would doze in class because of the medication I had to take for my seizures. And so, if anything, in the beginning, the teachers assumed that I was actually not necessarily handicapped, but mentally handicapped, but there was like a delay, maybe. They certainly did not consider me gifted at all. And what happened is I began to talk, but I was talking to myself, talking aloud, and so that started to get attention, not always positive attention, as you can imagine. I remember that in the primary school I went, there were lots of trees around the borders of the playground, and I would go up to the trees, and the people thought I was talking to the trees. This is one of the things that people would say behind my back: Daniel talks to trees. And in fact, nobody talks to trees, not even autistic people talk to trees. But what I was actually doing was more interesting than having a conversation with a tree, although as interesting as that must be for a novelist to imagine such a conversation with an oak, a beech, an elm. But it was a tree that, I'm not very good with trees. I'm not entirely sure what tree it was. I think it might have been a beech. I remember the bark. The bark it was scaly, it was flaky. And because of this texture, I had a word in my head that was the exact same texture as the bark. It was the word cufflink. And this word, just saying it aloud, as I am now 40 years later, cufflink, it brings up this tree, the bark on the tree. It's exactly that texture. And to my mind's fingers, the feel of cufflink was the feel of the bark. So when I was going up to the tree, I didn't even have to touch the tree. I could just say the word aloud. And I was having the sensation of the bark on my fingers, my mind's fingers. And when I looked up, I could see light coming through the leaves, and it was sparkling, and it was like multiplying twos by itself, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 1, 2, 8, 2, 5, 6, 512, 1000, 24, 2048, 4096. It's that texture, that sparkliness. And so I was doing like this, and I was saying the numbers, And so the people who were around me, the children and some of the teachers, they could see this, of course, and they didn't understand. So the only way that they could understand this was to say, okay, Daniel talks to trees. And the other thing that I did I remember when I was with the trees, is I could hide from the other children, because if I didn't yet have consciousness of how other people's minds worked, and I knew that if I put myself behind one of the trees, that I would disappear, that nobody could see me, and it was like disappearing. And so I would go behind a tree, and I would assume that I was actually no longer there, that I was in my own world, in my mind. And so that's how I felt safe. I felt comfortable behind the trees. So that gives you an idea of my early childhood. I remember I was very good at school, academically, from that point on. I still found it difficult knowing how to express myself, how to talk to other children, how to find words. Like this word cufflink, I don't even know how I came across it. It's not a word that a young child uses. I must have read it somewhere and loved the colour, the golden colour of it and the flaky texture, and just remembered it for that reason without paying attention to what it might mean. But when I started reading, I went to the library. I was very young. I went to the library for the first time. The library was like my second home. It was my home away from home. I spent hours there. And I would go into the library, and I was very small. I was maybe 2 bookshelves tall when I first started. And I would go in and I would look around and I see all the books with names. There was a different name on every book. And that first time, I don't know exactly how old I was, 5 or 6 maybe. So to that 5 or 6-year-old imagination, it seemed natural to me that if I went around the library far enough and wide enough and looked at all of the books with all the different names, I would eventually come across the book with my name on it. And then I could open the book of my life, perhaps from the end, rather than beginning at the beginning, because I wanted to know how it ends. What happens in my life, so I can anticipate what's going to happen and perhaps even cheat destiny in some way. So I was looking for this book and spending a long time doing so and never finding it, of course. And it's amazing to imagine all these years later, 40 years later, that my books are now published in 30 languages around the world, so I can find my name on books all around the world. I took the books from the library, I read them. When I would open a book, I would just be plunged into a world of colours and textures. Words and numbers have colours, textures, meanings to me that are intimate and personal and powerful. So when I open the book, it's like particularly as a child, it was a completely dazzling experience. I would see the word, the number, the page 4, for example, the number 4 on the page was a pointy number, it's a shy number, and it was how I thought of myself. I thought of myself as like the number 4 because as a child I was very shy. And so I was like the number 4. If I turn to the page 11, well, that's what my husband looks like. He looks like the number 11 because he's beautiful, and there's like the number 11. If I turn to the page 89, it was like falling snow. And sometimes in books, they talk about snow on page 89, and it's perfect for me. It's like a perfect fit. It's like someone had written a book just for me, with a secret code that only I can decipher. And so I was enjoying all of these experiences and learning so much, but I really wanted to do was learn to talk to other children, and that was what I couldn't do. So I was taking these books and trying out sentences in the playground, and of course nobody in the playground talks like books, so it didn't work. So then I had the idea that if I went to fiction, maybe I would be able to, it would be more like how people speak. It's true, people don't speak like dictionaries or encyclopedias. I did, but I'm not a good example. Neurotypical children talk like maybe more, that's what I was thinking, more like in a comic book or a novel or something. So I would go into Tintin, but of course people don't speak like Captain Haddock either. So then I would go into children's fiction, but they don't talk like Winnie the Pooh either. And then I would go to adult fiction, more like, adult fiction, But this was the 1980s, so the novels were really old. They're full of dust, like really greasy dust, and like from the 1950s, and children just did not speak like that at all. But what I found so interesting in those novels, in those really dusty novels, was that for the first time I had the idea that I could read people's thoughts, literally read their thoughts, because of course dialogue is written word for word. They actually say, he thought, comma, and then there's words, They even put like quotation marks around them. So it's really helpful. So I thought, this is fantastic. This is a brilliant way for me to learn how people are, what people are saying in their head. The only trouble is sometimes the novels are uneven. The dialogue is not always the best written part of the book. And if you go into a playground and try and talk like in those novels with that particular dialogue, it doesn't always work. That was my experience anyway. So I would feel frustrated, but always going back and forth between the library and the playground. And this whole experience of learning, it was really helpful, it was really beneficial, because I was learning all the time that I was making mistakes and sounding like something out of Tintin or Winnie the Pooh or whatever these adult novels were. I was nonetheless learning how to express myself. I was learning words and learning how words are used in a social context. And that really helped me to gain some confidence. And then I remember when I was, so I did really well at school. So I was struggling socially, but academically I did well. And my teachers, I was very lucky in my teachers. They were incredibly encouraging, incredibly supportive of me. They didn't understand exactly what I had, of course, what was different about me, but they understood that there was something special there, something sensitive and something interesting, and they wanted to nurture that, encourage that, and I was incredibly lucky, and I remember their names to this day for that reason. I wish for all of you that you had some teacher in your life that was as nurturing as I had that, you know, because it changes your life, it really does. So when I remember I went to secondary school after primary, obviously, and I that was when I was first learning about languages. Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about language because Simon mentioned my love of language. I always felt growing up like a foreigner. I never felt like an English person, never. Partly because when I spoke, I had an accent. The children thought I had an accent when I spoke English because I was using words that were not native, necessarily words that a native speaker would use in those particular situations, or because there were words that were too long or too bookish, or it didn't sound native to their ears. So I was very conscious of having this accent, and I knew that it was a stigma. I knew that it was something negative. So I was always very conscious of having an accent. And then one day, a little bit before secondary school, in fact, I was maybe 9 or 10, I didn't even realize that there were other languages. I knew in my heart's heart there must be, because I felt like a foreigner. So by virtue of feeling like a foreigner, I knew that there must be other languages, but I'd never had any evidence to that effect. And so one day there was a neighbor 2 doors down who moved in, and the lady was from Finland. And her husband was Scottish. They had a daughter. The daughter had only been raised in English. What a shame, knowing now what we know about bilingualism. But she was my sister's age. My sister and her played together. And the daughter didn't want to learn Finnish. She didn't want to. The mother wanted her to learn her mother tongue, literally her mother tongue, but she didn't want to. She wanted to be like the other children. So the mother had given her a picture book, a Finnish picture book, and the daughter just passed it on to my sister. And my sister, not knowing what to do with a Finnish picture book, knew who to give it to. She gave it to me. She gave the book to me. And when I opened the book for the first time, I was, like with books in general, but for this book even more so, there was a picture of an apple. I remember this beautiful apple. And underneath the picture was another picture. In fact, it wasn't a picture, it was a word, but for me it was like a picture. It was the word omena, which means apple, of course, in Finnish. And I just thought, what a beautiful way to say apple. Just the whole shape of the word, it just felt like an apple shape. So I turned the page and there was the word for shoe, with a picture of a shoe, and then I turned the page again, and a dog, koira, turned the page, cat, kissa, and then I turned the page again, and there was a house, a talo. And I said to myself, I could live in that house. That's the house, that's my home. I felt like the Finnish language was my home, that I could spend all my life living in the house of the Finnish language. And so I said to myself, that must be my mother tongue. I was born in the wrong family, I'm Finnish. And actually, when I had the opportunity to visit Finland many years later, people said to me, you do look Finnish, you have blonde hair and blue eyes. You could totally pass for Finnish. And then when I got to secondary school, it got kind of complicated because I realized there were other foreign languages. There was French, there was German. I started to learn French, I started to learn German. And every time that I began to have exposure to another language, I said, well, maybe I got confused. I said, well, is this my mother tongue? Is this my real mother tongue, French? Or is German? I don't know, because apparently I look like a German person as well. I could pass for German. So I was really confused. I didn't know. I didn't know. So I don't know to this day which language I should have been born into. I don't know. It's an open question. And so, but I learned some French, I learned some German. I was good at these languages, and my teachers encouraged me for that reason. They encouraged me in history as well, because in history I knew all of the dates and the facts, and when my teacher made a mistake on the blackboard, I could correct him. And he was very good about it, I realize now with hindsight. He just said, okay, he just trusted me, because he knew that if I was correcting him, I was right. So, but I wasn't trying to show off. I hate showing off. I was just, it just came naturally, spontaneously to me. If someone put a number and it wasn't the right number, it would just come out of me what the number should be, or the word, or the fact, or whatever it was. And the teachers, but what was great about history is they were also teaching me narrative. They were teaching me how to construct thought, how to construct words on a page, how to have a beginning, a middle, and end, how words should flow, how they should be meaningful to other people, not only meaningful to myself. So I was beginning to acquire these skills, little by little. And when I finished school, I was 18. I didn't feel ready for university, so I didn't go to university at that time. In the end, university went to me. I became a distance learning student in my 30s with the Open University, and I got a first class honours degree in the humanities. And the last year, the Open University very kindly, very generously awarded me an honorary doctorate. So I owe a lot to that form of learning. I didn't go to university then at 18. I didn't feel ready. I didn't have any of the social skills, I guess, that you have, you who are students here present today. I envy your skills. I had found it so difficult learning how to look people in the eye. People would say to me, "Why are you looking me in the eye so much?" Because I was doing it too much. I was overcompensating. So I had to learn to look and then not look and then look and then not look. It's a real art. I don't know how you do it. And so I was looking and not looking, looking and not looking. I was acquiring all of these things and thinking, these people think I'm strange. Neurotypicals can be very strange as well. Why would you look at someone and then look away? Why would you do that? So I applied for a scheme because I had always felt like I was a foreigner, as you remember. I didn't know if I was Finnish anymore, if I was French, if I was German, whatever I was, I didn't know. But I knew I wanted to go overseas, so I applied to a scheme that invited young people from backgrounds like my own to have experience overseas as a volunteer. I applied, and I could have been sent to all kinds of countries. In the end, it wasn't my choice. They just sent me to the Baltics, and this was not very long after the Soviet Union fell. So my parents were completely terrified at the prospect of me going behind the Iron Curtain, as it was for 50 years. And I had no consciousness of this, of course. I'd studied history, but this was real history. This wasn't the history in books, this was real history, and I didn't yet have that conception of history, that I was entering history. So I just wanted to go and be a volunteer and meet people and broaden my horizons. My parents let me go. They said, okay, if you're going to have people around you, and there were people around me to protect me, to encourage me, to support me, they said, okay, so we will let you go. You have to call us, you have to write to us, you have to, okay. So I went to Lithuania, and Lithuania was where for 50 years they couldn't speak Lithuanian. They could only speak Russian. They have beautiful literature, but they didn't have access to the literature. They had to hide books under the floorboards, literally. People told me these stories. This was real history. It wasn't the history that I was learning in school. And I felt how powerful the word can be. I'd always felt the power in words, but this was something else, that people could be frightened of words enough, a regime frightened enough of words to actually ban a language from being spoken aloud. It seemed incredible to me. So even though I wasn't yet a writer, it planted a seed in me. I thought, okay, this is incredible. These people who are able to use language in this way, it sounds beautiful to me. And then I had wonderful students who I was teaching English, which is ironic when you think about it. But because it had always come strangely to me, English, I guess I was teaching it in a way that was original as well. I was using poems and songs. I wasn't using textbooks at all. And the students, they really liked this approach. It was so different to the approaches they'd had up until then. And they were all old enough to be my mum or my grandmum. So it was like I had 20 grandmothers and mothers to look out for me. So it was really wonderful. I felt very protected and very loved. When I came back from Lithuania, I was in my early 20s then, coming into my 20s. I didn't know what to do with my life. I had no idea. I had no models to follow. I had no, either in my family or anywhere else. I didn't know. I couldn't think of a single person who was like me. And I remember, as Simon mentioned earlier, the number pi. I remember the number pi. I don't know why I remember this number, but I'd been at school, in secondary school, like all of you I imagine, I'd learned about the number pi, this beautiful number that in its decimal representation goes on forever, literally goes on forever. And I just had felt so amazed at the idea of a number that goes on forever, that even if you had paper the size of Cambridge, or the size of England, United Kingdom, the world, the universe, you wouldn't have enough paper to write all the digits down on. And I just found this incredibly magical, and it spoke very powerfully to me. So when I came back from Lithuania, I'd been given a volunteer grant. And with the money, it wasn't a lot of money, but it was just enough money for my family for the first time to acquire a computer. So I was able to access the internet. It was pretty early then, but there was already websites. I think there was Google already, just about. And I came across a website that its whole reason, its whole existence was just to calculate the digits of pi. That's all it did. That was its job. And I decided one day that I would begin printing out the numbers of pi, because I'd felt so frustrated at school having learned only 3.141, because it felt to me like there was a story there. I could feel the story, the pictures and the meanings inside these numbers. It had to be something very beautiful, but I couldn't see it. It was like being taught Shakespeare and only being given the first 4 words of Macbeth or Hamlet. And you want to read more. You don't just want 4 words. It's like Once Upon a Time, but you want to know, yes, but how does it continue? So 3.141, Once Upon a Time. Okay, but what? What's going to happen? What happened? So with the computer, I was finally able to acquire the continuation and print out these digits page by page by page, 1,000 digits, I think it was, per page. And I printed them out, and I just felt like I was going to my home country, the country of numbers, how I see numbers with the shapes and the textures and the meanings. They formed landscapes in my mind, and I spent hours exploring these landscapes until I could tell every nook and every cranny. And without even doing it consciously, I mean, it wasn't like I said to myself, I'm going to learn pi until this number of digits. They just entered my head and my heart. And it occurred to me that this would be a way for me, finally, to speak in my mother tongue. And perhaps I would make myself understood in a way that I'd never been able to until then. So I contacted someone at Oxford who represented an epilepsy charity. Remember, I'd had seizures as a child, and that was close to my heart. And he helped to organise this event, this public event. A journalist from the Times learned about it, was very curious to interview me, and there was an article that appeared. So people knew to come on the day and listen to the man who speaks pi. So they came, and I don't know if there were as many as you, perhaps, more or less. The numbers changed, they fluctuated during the day. It lasted over 5 hours, the recitation. So people came and went and they listened. And what was so incredible is that some of them were mathematicians, of course. There were even a few that had to, as Simon mentioned, had to invigilate me with very sharp pencils and make sure that every digit was correct. That's very important, apparently, to their minds. But for me, the most important thing was just the flow and the rhythm, and the fact that I was embodying these numbers. I was pi, and pi was me, and pi was my story. I was telling my story not in English, or French, or Finnish, or German. I was telling it in Pi. And the numbers that were deeply meaningful to me became meaningful to the public, because they could hear in the way that I was expressing them all of the rhythm and the flow and the meaning and the emotion, and that they could understand. I didn't look at them very often. I was so much involved in my own recitation, even though it was like an artistic performance. I didn't feel like an artist on stage. But there was a moment when I looked up near the end, and I remember very clearly that there was a lady with tears in her eyes. And it said to me something very important, that if I had a gift, it wasn't just for counting, it was for recounting. And at that point I realized I wanted to be a writer. I could be a writer. That was my vocation. So I began to write. I wrote the story of my life, which became Born on a Blue Day. It became an international bestseller. And ever since, in 20 years, I've become a pioneer of what we call today the neurodivergent experience. When I began writing 20 years ago, critics and journalists almost didn't know what to do with my writing. They, for some of them, didn't believe that an autistic man could write books at all. So I had to, with every book, persuade publishers, critics, readers, although it seemed readers needed much less persuasion than the others, that this was something, this was a career in progress. And with every book, I went other places. I tried out different genres. I've written essays, I've written fiction, poetry, literary reportage. And so with the book that I want to very briefly introduce today, the book that I'm publishing in the UK, it's called 9 Minds. And as it says on the cover, so there are 9 minds inside the book. I guess there's a 10th mind, which is mine, which is the mind that permeates these pages, that brings them to life on the page. 9 Minds tells the story of 9 men and women from all around the world. So people from the United Kingdom and Ireland, but also from America, Canada, France, Nigeria, Japan, Australia, all around the world who are neurodivergent, what we call neurodivergent today. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to very briefly not talk about all 9 of them, but talk about maybe 2 or 3 of them very briefly, just to give you an idea of the people in the book and why their stories appeal to me. It feels to me important, first and foremost, that these lives are told in literature. For many years, literature was very, it belonged to a single category of society, and it reflected a very narrow part of society. Women's stories for many years were neglected or ignored completely. Black stories were not told. LGBT voices were not heard. And to this day, neurodivergent voices are still missing in the bookshelves. So my book has the ambition of filling that gap in bookshops and libraries where these stories should be told. The story of Warren, for example, Warren is from Birmingham, so he speaks with a Brummy accent. He's a very down-to-earth person, very humble person. It was quite hard for me to convince him, although he'd spoken in the press, and that's how I'd come across his story. He didn't know if it was a story that was worth telling. And when he began to tell it to me, I said, this is incredible. Of course you have to tell this story. Of course I'm happy to find the word to tell this story. Warren is a policeman. He's a detective, and he solves murders. He's autistic. Warren is autistic. And he has been able to solve 91 murders. And with his autism, he is able to understand clues that neurotypical policemen do not pick up on. And because of his neurodivergency, he isn't seduced by solutions that seem plausible on the surface, and because neurotypicals are very keen on wishful thinking as well. If you want someone to be the suspect number 1 because they have a lot of crimes in the past, and they were in the area, and they were even on CCTV cameras, and so everything seems to point in their direction. But there's often, if you know how to look at evidence, there's something that's not quite right, and so one at a glance can look at that evidence and say, there's something that's not right, and he can find out what that is and say, it's not him, it's someone else. You're not looking for the right person. And so he told me the story. So I won't spoil it for you, but the story of, I asked him to tell me the story of the most complicated murder that he ever had to solve, and it took 6 months of investigation, and he solved it, and he used his autistic abilities and his life story as well, his whole background, because he came to the police in his 20s. He was a mechanic originally. His dad worked in cars, and he tells me that solving murders is kind of like fixing cars as well. There's the whole mechanical side of murders. Committing murder is quite a complicated act, in fact. You have to really, there's a lot of nuts and bolts about it. And so he is able to piece all those pieces together, and work out how it works. So that's one example. A second example, very quickly, is Amanda. Amanda is an Australian lady. She came to me. She was the one person in the book who actually came to me because she knew I'd written about Les Murray, the amazing poet, Australian poet Les Murray, who is autistic. And he is considered one of the most important poets of the 20th century, even though that seems like a contradiction. And for many years, critics have refused to engage with his autism for that very reason. But his poetry, which was in contention for the Nobel Prize many times, is full of images that are neurodivergent. It's a beautiful poetry. If you've not read it, I really do invite you to read it. And so Amanda studied his poetry, and her perspective is very interesting because not only is she autistic, but she's blind. She was born blind. And so her poetry comes to her from Braille. She reads in Braille. So it's not just how I see words with colours. It's the textures. It's really literally the textures. But she almost has a kind of synesthesia as well, because she says to me that the words, as I show in the book, they have all kinds of, they come to life in her mind as well. But it's really, like I was saying earlier about cufflinks, when I told her that story, she said, that's exactly it. That's exactly what I'm doing with Braille. I'm feeling the word book, for example, and it's an expansive motion. It's like the universe expanding. Or if I'm feeling the word taxi, it's like zigzags, it's like lightning. And it's just entirely beautiful to her. And she has an amazing ability, which you may or may not have heard of. It's called echolocation. So if she comes into a room, it's what bats and whales have to navigate the world. When she comes into a room, she can not see, obviously, but she can hear how big the room is. She can hear how many people are in the room, more or less. She can hear where the furniture is, the dimensions of the furniture. Her hearing is so acute, no doubt her autism is part of this, that if there is a bottle of water in the room, she can hear if the bottle is half full or 2/3 full, because it makes a different sound in her mind. So these examples, these stories give you some inkling of what the neurodivergent mind is capable of, and why it was so important for me, from my own experience, to bring these stories to readers' attention, because I feel that they can enrich everyone, people obviously who are familiar with or interested in neurodivergent experience, but everyone else, because we all have minds, we all have inner lives. We've long heard from people like Oliver Sacks, who was a wonderful writer, but whose empathy and gifts as a writer failed him when it came to writing about autism. He once described autistic twins he met as a grotesque Tweedledee and Tweedledum. It's a shame, but it shows how far we've come as a society that those descriptions no longer appear, and the stories of these men and women are now available in print to be discovered, firsthand. I should also mention very briefly that the final story, the longest story in the book, is the most famous. It's for those who know him, but I imagine most of you have heard of him, Dan Aykroyd, the comic actor, the brains behind Ghostbusters. He actually wrote the original screenplay. And 20 years ago, when I was first diagnosed by Simon, he went on to National Public Radio, Dan Aykroyd, and mentioned that he had Asperger's, that he identifies as having Asperger's. And because I wasn't able to interview him as the only person in the book I wasn't able to get hold of directly, but because I have lived in Canada and know people who knew Dan as a child, grew up with him, I was able to learn all about his childhood, stories about his incredible mind, his own mind, and the development of that mind that have never been published anywhere before. So if you're a fan of Dan Aykroyd, that's a chapter I would particularly recommend, because it's really fascinating. Blues Brothers, you know, all of these amazing films, and to imagine that they spring out of an autistic imagination, well, it just seems obvious to me, but apparently to many people it's surprising when they learn that. So it felt important for there to be both people who are distinguished but not necessarily famous, and people who are world famous like Dan Aykroyd as well, to really show just how vast the spectrum is. I'm going to stop now. There's some time for questions. If you would like to ask questions, don't be like the number 4, don't be shy. Please put up your hand, ask away, and I will answer your questions.
We do have people online. Who would like to start with any questions? Tracy.
Thank you, Daniel. That's so interesting to hear. When you were talking about your school life, you talked about these wonderful teachers that supported you and recognised your talent. I was wondering whether you also struggled with the sensory environment at school. You didn't describe kind of having to run out of classes or if those kinds of things that we often hear.
Yes.
Is that there in the story and you just didn't have time to talk about it?
It's really interesting because I think it's a change in culture maybe, that when I was a child in the 1980s, I don't know if it was my education that I had from my parents as well, I didn't even know that it was possible to run out of class. It just didn't occur to me that I had the opportunity, that I had the possibility of doing that if it was overwhelming. I just had to absorb it, take it in. I didn't know that it was possible for me to do that. So I would just learn to, I would go into my mind and I would just play with my first friends, which were numbers. I would just play with them, you know, oh, hi 4, hi 11, you know, hi 89, you know, whatever. I would just play with them and make sums up in my head and play with, you know, and that would occupy me and that would make me feel safe. And then, but I do remember, I mean, I said that the teachers were wonderful and they were globally, but of course there were always some exceptions. There were always some teachers who didn't understand. So if I didn't look them in the eyes, they would say, why aren't you looking at me? Or if I was doing something they didn't understand, they would say, what are you doing? You know, what? And I didn't know what to say. So I would just feel completely lost for words and embarrassed and be bright red. And I remember once I was sitting and I had my leg, I was sitting on one of my feet because I don't know why, but it just felt like I should do that. And someone passed me and she said, you should never do that. You're going to have a bad back. And 40 years later, I remember this person telling me this, you know. So it's amazing what you remember, you know. So I remember that. But globally, yes, my teachers were very good to me and I'm incredibly grateful to them to this day.
Right, Eliza at the back.
Hi, thank you so much. That was incredible. And one of the things that I kind of felt during your talk, as well as something that I felt as an autistic person that works in autism advocacy in that space, is the recognition that comes from hearing other autistic people share their stories. That like that feeling of a community I didn't know existed in the way that it does.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the value of community and of these like kind of connections that we make with each other in helping kind of support mental health and support just the quality of life that we live as autistic people?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. Thank you for your question. I mean, one of the people in the book is a Japanese lady, and she did all her studies in America and Britain because she, like me, like many autistic people, she felt like a foreigner growing up. She didn't feel like Japanese. She didn't feel like Japanese was her language. She prefers to think in English. So she went to Britain and America. She got her diagnosis over there. In Japan, there's a lot of misunderstanding around autism. So she went to America, she got her diagnosis in America, and she decided that she would become a researcher in psychology herself because she felt there was such a misunderstanding around these questions. She wanted to be a pioneer of that research, and that's one of the reasons I was speaking at Cray the other night, because she had worked with Cray. She'd worked in that centre where they invite both neurotypical and neurodivergent researchers to work together, and that's a wonderful idea, you know, to really bring both kinds of minds together to better understand how every mind works, but particularly the minds on the spectrum. And Kanna actually studies loneliness. Her whole doctorate was about loneliness, and for many years doctors and scientists believed, probably not Simon, but many did, they believed that autistic people were not capable of feeling lonely because they're just so much in their head that they just never feel lonely. Of course, Kanna, like myself and every autistic person, knows that's not true at all. You know, it's probably the opposite of what could be felt as being true. So she's an amazing example of someone who's using her own experience and her talents to bring better understanding of loneliness in a way that will help everyone. She's actually helped create a scale of loneliness that could be applied universally to both neurotypical and neurodivergent minds. So when people describe their experiences of loneliness, there's a way of uniformizing it, so we can actually make it understandable, whether it's a Japanese person or a British person or whatever. It cuts across language and cultural differences and gets to the heart of the human condition, because I think fundamentally we are all lonely. Fundamentally, as human beings, we are born alone and we will die alone, not to make you too depressed. And so we're always looking for connections as human beings, and autistic people doubly so, because the normal ways about which humans go to acquire these connections don't come easily to us. So we are finding our own ways into the world and connecting with people. But the connections we form as a result of that, because we're not flying on automatic pilot, you know, we're having to really guide it ourselves, you know, every moment. Those connections, I'm speaking for myself, but I'm sure for you and for many people it's the same. Those connections are incredibly deep and meaningful, and so that goes to the heart of again what the book is all about. You know, these connections and telling these stories as a way of people saying, either because, oh, okay, I'm also on the spectrum, I totally get it. You know, I feel validated by these experiences, by these stories, or by people who are not at all autistic, you know, what we call neurotypical, but they say, okay, this actually opens our eyes. You know, we really see ways of being human, of being in the world that we just had never even perhaps realized, you know, existed before, you know, and they do. So that's very enriching as well.
Thank you, Daniel. More questions? Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I thought that was just, so interesting and so beautiful. When you were telling us the story about hiding behind trees in order to disappear, you said that you didn't yet have consciousness of how other people's minds worked. But it's very clear from the way you're speaking to us today that actually you now certainly have a very acute sense of what other people, or how other people might respond to you, or how, or you know, what we'll find funny and what we'll find interesting. Is that something that you've felt conscious of changing over time, or is it something that you've kind of learned? What do you have a sense of that?
It would have been fascinating to have been followed as a child by researchers and have this progress documented. It would have been incredible, an incredible documentary. I do remember as a child feeling utter bewilderment. That was the predominant feeling I had, utter bewilderment. I would go into school and I would find it a struggle even to navigate in the corridors and the classrooms. So even though I'd been there many times before, I had very little spatial awareness. I had no concept of personal space. I would walk up to people and I'd literally almost tread on their toes, you know. And so I had to learn how to, Kana also, by the way, Kana, the Japanese researcher, she had to learn that as well. And because she loves ballet, she learned that tutus are a way of imagining personal space. So now when she meets people, she imagines they're all wearing imaginary tutus. And it's a fantastic way of, I wish I'd thought of that myself. So so I felt just complete bewilderment. I had no knowledge of other people's minds. I always feel uncomfortable saying that in a way because it makes me feel like I didn't love my parents. But I did, you know, I loved them profoundly, but I just didn't have that consciousness. It was unconscious, but I completely felt loved. But I didn't have any conscious feeling about it. And then later, as I got older, I was starting to realize this. As a teenager, I still didn't have a lot of consciousness. I remember that as well, because my body image, I had very little understanding of my body image. People would tease me about my appearance because I didn't know how to dress my hair, how to style myself, how to, you know. And then when I got to, in fact, it was when I fell in love. I think that was the turning point. I fell in love the first time, and in my early 20s, and it just completely, there was like a transformation in my ability to read other people. Like I could look, somebody loved me, found me attractive and beautiful, like the number 11. And having someone look at me and be able to see that, it completely transformed my image of myself. I said, okay, I can see this, you know. And from that point on, it was still a gradual process, but that really was the turning point. From that point on, I realized that I had value, and what I was going to be able to say would interest other people, you know.
Robert.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was really wonderful, and it has given me a couple of light bulb moments, which is really good. I just wanted to ask you about what you mentioned about learning how long to keep eye contact with people. And I just wanted to ask you, how did you learn that, and who helped you, and what did you find helpful from learning that?
My parents taught me a lot. The teachers sometimes as well. I had a teacher, so for example, with conversation, learning how to take turns in conversation, how to do conversation, it was my German teacher who taught me how to converse in English. Because I was at secondary school and she was an odd lady. I don't know if she was on the spectrum, but everyone teased her because she was quite eccentric. And she invited me to her home once a week. So I would take the bus, the red bus, you know, I would take the bus. I would sit on the top deck, because when you're on the top deck, you feel like you're flying. And I would so I'd fly to her home, and then I would go to her home and I'd sit down and she would make tea and we would talk. And we'd talk a little bit in German, of course, because she was paid to teach me German, to talk to me in German. But because we were at her home, officially she didn't have to teach me, you know, German. So she said, actually, I'm going to talk to you in English. And so she just we talked together, just very simple conversations. And I realized with hindsight that that's what she was doing. She was teaching me to take turns and to know how to look at her and how to read the situations. But I remember one thing very clearly. I'm going to have to I'm going to have to drop the microphone in a moment because I want to show you what it was. Maybe you have seen this, because I've heard of hand flapping, but what I did as a child, it was not quite hand flapping, it was something else. As a small child, whenever I felt excited, I would take my hands and I would do this. I don't know if any of you researchers are aware of this, or have seen this in autistic people. And so I would do this all the time, or under my chin as well, like this. And the children, when they teased me, they would come up to me and they would take their hands and they would imitate me doing this, you know. So one day, my mum, I was at home and I began doing this, and she took my hands very firmly, but gently, and she said, no, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do this, because you'll be teased, you'll be bullied, and that's not what we do. And from that moment on, I never did it again. But, you know, so there was sometimes it was firm. My parents could be firm as well, but always loving and gentle as well.
Thank you. There's a question on the side there.
Your story was so joyful. That was sort of the emotion I got from it. But I was wondering, so much of your story is also about you being open to learning and, you know, constantly. And I wondered whether that was just something that came naturally, and so you really wanted to do that, or whether there were moments where actually it was very hard to keep going, to get to a point where you felt you had sufficiently learnt enough about, you know, various things you wanted to learn more about. Whether you could talk a little more about that.
So when it was things that I felt passionate about, like language or numbers, or I always wanted to go further because it was passion. There was a passion there, so it felt natural for me to want to go further and further and further. Like with the number pi, you know, I almost didn't want to stop, you know, but I realised I had to stop at some point because reciting for 5 hours was like running 2 marathons in my head, you know. And after 2 marathons, I just didn't have any stamina left to continue. But another part of it is just that because, like I mentioned, as a child, I felt complete bewilderment very often. That was one of the predominant emotions that I remember. I just had to keep going, in fact. I had to keep going because I felt I didn't have a choice. If I didn't continue pushing myself, I would never acquire social skills. I would never be able to live an independent life. And I seem to have realized this as quite young, as a young child, that I would just need to work 10 times harder than everyone else in order to acquire the skills that everyone takes for granted. But in doing so, actually, I ended up mastering language, for example, to a degree that even neurotypical people find impressive. So, but that wasn't the goal. You know, I never had the idea of saying, okay, I'm going to master whatever, I'm going to be a writer. As a child, I couldn't ever imagine writing books myself one day. But there was just this idea that I just had to push myself constantly. And it was often uncomfortable, profoundly uncomfortable. But I felt I didn't have a choice. And also I had the good fortune of my family, my teachers, the rare friends that I did make, rare friends who were from immigrant backgrounds, felt different in their own way and were often perceived as different, obviously. So we were able to connect on that basis. And they encouraged me, they pushed me. There was a boy, an Iranian boy called Babak, I remember, and he loved words as much as I did, and we would play Scrabble together, for example. So that's a very simple example of using something that I loved doing and that he was good at, and actually creating a social interaction. And what was so sweet about Babak is because he wasn't a native English, his English was remarkable, but he wasn't a native speaker. And because he assumed that I was technically a native speaker, but I never felt like a native speaker. So he would always defer to me. So if I played a word on the Scrabble board, because I just loved the texture of the word or the feeling of the word, sometimes it wasn't actually a proper English word. But because he deferred to me, saying, okay, you're the native speaker, okay, I'm going to learn this word, you know. So I must have taught him many words that exist in my English, but don't exist in any other. So I always won.
Yeah.
But it wasn't entirely fair.
We're going to come back to you just because we've got a few questions online, and you too. Simon, do you want to read?
Yes, there's lots of thank you messages. There's one from David Johnson in Icelandic. But I think he's saying thank you.
I'll look at that, yes. Thank you.
So the first question is from Abby. Abby's asking, if a child's ability is not getting recognised at school due to language difficulties, how to help an academically able child with these communication difficulties?
That's a very good question. And that's why it's so important to raise awareness of these abilities on the spectrum, because often that's the first part of it, you know, actually making teachers aware that these abilities exist and can exist from an early age. And it's not because someone is not proficient in English or in the native English that neurotypical people use, that automatically means that they don't have, you know, abilities even in imagination and creativity that often were thought impossible for many years, you know, for people on the spectrum. And it was actually more to do with a lack of curiosity on the part of neurotypical teachers, perhaps, or scientists in some cases. And also because neurodivergent people can find it much harder simply to find the words to say, you know, what's going on in their minds. So I think that actually telling these stories, that's a part of it as well, raising that awareness. And hopefully the research that you're doing here, like Simon is doing and that your colleagues are doing, I've had the opportunity to meet some of the wonderful researchers here, that research, that working as well, like Cray, with researchers who are on the spectrum themselves as well, so you're benefiting both from external and internal experiences of you know, perceptions of autism. I think that will help society move forward, and hopefully in the future schools as well, although schools are difficult in any place, to catch up to the reality, the complex but fascinating reality of neurodivergent experiences.
So go ahead.
You talked about really people at one end of the spectrum, but I wonder whether you had any particular insights in communicating with people who actually don't speak. I mean, I have on my wife's side of the family a nephew who understands two languages, English and Amharic, but he doesn't talk, and that's the big orchestral movements, and there's really no communication with him, but he'll understand you if you're talking. I just wonder whether you have any more insights on how you can communicate with people.
So first of all, thank you for that, making that point, absolutely, that neurodivergency is a spectrum, absolutely, and so there are different ends and there's incredible amount of variety within that spectrum. One of the 9 minds in the book, it was important to me that be the case. One of the 9 minds is a non-verbal man in America, so he has never spoken. Well, he learned a few words as a very small child, and then he lost those words, and he's never spoken ever since. And I spoke a lot with his mum, obviously, to learn about his story, to learn about how, and I watched lots of footage, home footage of his early years, and I really tried to get inside his mind using my own experience as an autistic man, and also my imagination as a writer, because of course in the end it's impossible to know 100%, of course, what is going on inside the mind of someone who is not using language to communicate their experience. And it was important to me as well not to put words into his mouth. So it was a very delicate exercise, but a very interesting one, because his story was fascinating. He has a very high visual intelligence. If he goes into a room and he sees an object that's very slightly been moved, you know, he can instantly hone in on that and will correct the position. You know, it might be a pen on a table or a photograph or something, and his mum told me something very interesting once. She said, because he does understand words, he's been taught how to read, and he has a relationship with words. It's just not the relationship that other neurotypical people have, but which makes sense to me in a way. So once she was making a list of groceries, and she wrote down different ingredients, obviously different foods, and one of them was potatoes, but it was sweet potatoes. So she wrote sweet potatoes. And when Billy, his name is, when Billy saw the list, he took a pen and he crossed out sweet, because potatoes can't be sweet to him. You know, potatoes aren't sweet. So, you know, so he understands words, he can read words, he can interact with words, but he has his own conceptions of words as well. And it's a very visual intelligence. So when he's watching, his favourite thing is to watch The Snowman. You know, this animated film, The Snowman, which I watched as a child. And it's beautiful because there's no words. Apart from the song, the very famous song, there's no words at all. It's all pictures and emotion. And for him, it makes perfect sense. It's like his language. It's like something being broadcast in his language. So he can completely get that. So, and the one analogy I use in the book, a little bit provocatively, but I think interestingly, is that I've met with chess players of an incredibly high standard. I met with Vladimir Kramnik, for example, who was the world chess champion. He was the man who beat Kasparov, to give you an idea of how strong a chess player he is, to become world champion. And he explained to me that when he's playing chess, he does not think in words at all. People who are not very good at chess, they do, you know, they will use language to say, okay, if he does this, I'm going to go here. But in his mind, it's all pictures. And sometimes it's not even pictures, he says. He says it's energy. its structure, when he describes it, it's like how I see numbers. It's very close to how I see numbers. I was very excited to have that conversation with him in his home. And and I say in the book, you know, this is an example of the fact that you can have an incredible intelligence and think in pictures and have no words, have no need for words to achieve incredible results. And he's gone on to do amazing things in life. He's a gifted painter, he's a musician. So that is an example in the book of a non-verbal man doing amazing things. But also, I also tell the story of his family and how much of a struggle it was growing up for the doctors to take him seriously. Because if you don't have language, you are incredibly vulnerable, incredibly vulnerable. Hopefully less so today, but probably still to some extent today. But you know, his mum had to fight like a lion, you know, to help him to achieve the life that he has today. So I tell her story as well.
Because of the time, and you can hear the amount of interest in Daniel's life, really, we could have let this run and run, but we do have to wrap up. First of all, I want to thank you, Daniel, for just sharing your story. It made me feel actually that in a place like Trinity College, where we're kind of surrounded by this history, that, you know, there wasn't necessarily always a space for autistic or neurodivergent individuals to be visible and be heard. People have argued, of course, that in that history there were probably lots of autistic people, but we didn't have the word for it. But what you've done today in this very place is, first of all, allow us to hear you, an autistic voice, your voice. In your book, you're letting other autistic people speak. In response to Eliza's question about connection, and autistic people who might be here in the audience today, who are here in the audience today, just making them feel they belong and that they can connect with each other is fantastic. So just how far we've come in terms of making sure that we are including autistic people and hearing from them. So thank you very much.